that much. And I think if you don't care, then you can take the kind of chances that can consolidate your position.
Did you care about acting?
Probably not.
For decades, Hollywood painted Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward as the ultimate love story, two icons who managed to stay married for over 50 years in an industry known for its breakups and scandals. Their romance was celebrated as pure, passionate, and unbreakable. But now, decades after Paul's passing, their daughter has come forward, and what she's revealed about her parents' marriage is shaking the very foundation of that golden image. At 63, Melissa Newman, the daughter of Paul and Joanne, has finally broken her silence about what life was really like behind the closed doors of her family's glamorous home. While the world saw devotion and perfection, Melissa remembers tension, heartbreak, and moments when her parents' love nearly fell apart. She describes nights filled with arguments, days of emotional distance, and the haunting shadow of Paul's guilt from his past. Yes, they loved each other deeply. But their story was far from the fairy tale the tabloids made it out to be. Paul struggled with temptation, regret, and a drinking habit that often left Joanne feeling isolated and resentful. Meanwhile, Joanne wrestled with the painful truth that the man she loved had left another family behind for her. For the first time, their daughter's words reveal that even Hollywood's most enduring romance had its dark corners, full of passion, pain, and the quiet heartbreaks that fame could never hide. In the glittering world of classic Hollywood, few couples shined as brightly as Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. Their love story was legendary, spanning over 5 decades in an industry where marriages rarely lasted 5 years. From the moment they met in the early 1950s while working on Broadway, the chemistry between them was undeniable. Paul, with his piercing blue eyes and effortless charm, was still married to his first wife at the time, but Joanne saw something in him that went far beyond the image of a rising movie star. What started as a professional friendship soon blossomed into something much deeper and far more complicated. By the time they married in 1958, Paul and Joanne had already faced public scrutiny. Many viewed their union as scandalous, as Paul had divorced his first wife, Jacqueline Vitt, leaving behind 3 young children. Joanne knew that her relationship with Paul would never be simple, yet she believed in their connection wholeheartedly. To the public, their marriage was a fairy tale. 2 Academy Award-winning actors, deeply in love and seemingly immune to the heartbreak that haunted most celebrity relationships. But as their daughter Melissa Newman would later reveal, the reality behind closed doors was not nearly as perfect as it appeared. Melissa has described her parents' love as both passionate and turbulent. She remembers moments of laughter and tenderness, but also nights filled with tension and silence. Paul's devotion to Joanne was real, but so were his demons. He was a perfectionist, constantly torn between his career, his conscience, and his family. His guilt over his first marriage haunted him for years, and his struggle with alcohol often made home life unpredictable. "He loved us," Melissa said, "but sometimes he just wasn't there, even when he was sitting right in front of you." Joanne, for her part, carried her own emotional burdens. Though she adored Paul, she often felt overshadowed by his fame. Early in their marriage, she had been the bigger star. She even won an Oscar before him. But as Paul's career skyrocketed, her own opportunities began to fade. Friends noticed that she grew quieter, more withdrawn, while Paul's success only seemed to magnify the distance between them. Still, the two shared a rare kind of bond that neither fame nor frustration could fully destroy. They were creative partners, best friends, and fierce supporters of each other's dreams. Even during their darkest times, they found ways to reconnect. Yet, Melissa's words make it clear that their life together was far from the serene love story Hollywood wanted to believe. It wasn't all perfect, she confessed. They fought hard, but they loved even harder. Behind the glamour, the laughter, and the beautiful photographs that captured them arm in arm, there were countless private battles, moments when Joanne questioned everything, and Paul struggled to live with his choices. Their marriage was real, raw, and deeply human, and though the world celebrated them as a flawless pair, Their daughter's revelations prove that even Hollywood's most golden couple lived with heartbreak just like everyone else. As their careers reached new heights, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward's marriage became the stuff of legend. To the world, they were a shining example of love that had stood the test of time. But as Melissa Newman later revealed, the deeper truth was far more fragile. The love that bound her parents together was passionate, yes, but it was also volatile, burdened by guilt, jealousy, and Paul's ongoing battle with the parts of himself he couldn't control. In his earlier years, Paul was open about his flaws. He was haunted by his decision to leave his first wife, Jacqueline Veit, and their 3 children. "I was brutal in my detachment," he once admitted. That guilt never left him and often spilled into his new marriage. Joanne, though understanding, couldn't help but feel the weight of that past hanging over their home. As Melissa described it, "There were ghosts in our house, and they weren't imaginary." The couple's relationship was also tested by Paul's drinking. He often joked about his love for beer and bourbon, but behind the humor was a serious dependency. When he was sober, he was charming, attentive, and loving. But when he drank too much, he could become distant, lost in his thoughts and regrets. Joanne's patience was remarkable, but even she had limits. Their daughter recalled nights when her mother would retreat to another room, exhausted by yet another argument. "Mom wasn't fragile," Melissa explained. "She was strong, but loving Dad wasn't always easy." Fame added another layer of pressure. The more Paul's star rose, the more Joanne's career began to fade. Reporters constantly compared their successes, often calling her the wife of Paul Newman, a title that diminished her own remarkable talent. Joanne, who had won an Oscar for The 3 Faces of Eve, never complained publicly, but the imbalance took its toll. Melissa remembered that her mother sometimes felt invisible, living in the shadow of a man she deeply loved but could never quite reach. Yet despite the hardships, the bond between them remained undeniable. Paul adored Joanne, often referring to her as his center and the reason I stay sane. He built a small retreat for her on their Connecticut property, a private space she called the sanctuary, where she could paint, read, or simply be alone. It was a place of peace in a life filled with noise. But even those quiet moments couldn't erase the cracks that years of emotional strain had created. Behind every photograph of Paul and Joanne smiling at movie premieres lay an untold story of effort and endurance. Melissa admitted that she didn't fully understand the depth of her parents' struggles until she was much older. "They were 2 people who refused to give up on each other," she said, "even when it would have been easier to walk away." To the world, Paul and Joanne represented the ideal marriage: loyal, romantic, timeless. But inside their home, love often meant compromise, forgiveness, and facing painful truths that fame couldn't fix. Their devotion to each other was real, but it was built on a foundation of hard lessons and human imperfection. And as Melissa would soon reveal, even that strength was tested again and again as the years went by, until tragedy finally forced them to confront the cost of loving so deeply for so long. By the early 1970s, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward had become the symbol of what Hollywood love was supposed to look like: loyal, glamorous, and everlasting. But behind the curtain of fame, the truth was far less romantic. Their marriage, though built on respect and devotion, carried the heavy weight of expectation and emotional distance. Newman's growing success as an actor and director meant long months on set, while Joanne, who had once been a rising star herself, found her own career quietly fading into the background. Paul often said that he owed much of his stability to Joanne, calling her the foundation of his life. But that devotion came with guilt. Joanne, who had already won an Academy Award by the time Paul truly broke out, began to sacrifice her own ambitions for their family and for Paul's career. Hollywood wasn't kind to aging actresses, and she found herself pushed to the sidelines as Newman's fame soared. For years, she smiled through interviews, calling herself lucky to have such a talented husband. Yet, deep inside, resentment and loneliness began to brew. Paul's life on the road only worsened things. While filming, he was often surrounded by temptation, beautiful co-stars, constant parties, and the adoration of fans. The rumors of affairs were impossible to ignore. And one name that repeatedly surfaced was journalist Nancy Bacon, with whom Paul was said to have had an emotional and physical relationship in the 1960s. Though Newman never publicly confirmed it, the whispers took a toll on Joanne, who was left to hold the family together while facing public humiliation in silence. Their daughter, years later, would admit that their home wasn't always as peaceful as it appeared. There were heated arguments behind closed doors, long stretches of silence, and moments when both parents seemed emotionally distant. Paul, guilt-ridden over his absences in fame, would often retreat into his passions, racing cars and working tirelessly in film, while Joanne turned to philanthropy and writing to fill the growing void. Despite everything, they refused to let their marriage collapse under the weight of Hollywood. Joanne's quiet strength became their anchor. Even when she was hurt, she stood by Paul, determined to preserve what they had built together. Her belief in him, despite his flaws, allowed their relationship to survive where so many others had failed. Yet that survival came at a personal cost, one that only their daughters would truly understand years later. The irony was that Paul's perfection in public was his greatest imperfection in private. The world saw him as a man of charm and moral integrity, the ideal husband and humanitarian. But at home, he battled inner demons, guilt, insecurity, and the pressure of maintaining a flawless image. Joanne bore the brunt of that struggle, caught between her love for him and the pain of being overshadowed by his legend. As their daughter would later reveal, they loved each other deeply, but they also wounded each other deeply. They were human, not icons. Behind every red carpet photo and every glowing magazine feature was a story of sacrifice, forgiveness, and the quiet price of perfection. Paul once said that the key to his marriage was that he and Joanne grew together, not apart. But growing together wasn't easy. It meant shedding illusions, accepting mistakes, and learning that love, no matter how strong, can't erase pain. What they shared wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far more real. Two flawed people holding on to each other in a world built on illusion. And while the cameras caught their smiles, only their family knew the tears that came once the lights went out. As the years passed, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward's love story matured into something far beyond Hollywood's fleeting romances. They grew old together in a quiet corner of Connecticut, far from the flashing cameras that once defined their lives. But even in their later years, the scars from their turbulent marriage lingered like faint echoes. Their daughter would later describe it as a beautiful love story wrapped in a lot of pain. Paul's health began to decline in the 2000s. And it was during this fragile period that the walls truly came down. Gone were the glamorous premieres and the demanding film schedules. What remained was raw honesty between two people who had spent half a century trying to understand each other. For the first time, Joanne and Paul began to openly discuss the regrets that had haunted their marriage. The late nights away from home, the unspoken resentments, the years Joanne felt unseen. All of it was finally brought into the light. Their daughter revealed in an interview that one evening, near the end, Paul turned to Joanne and said, "You were always stronger than me." It was a simple sentence, but one that carried decades of emotion. Joanne smiled, tears in her eyes, and responded, "You just never let yourself see it." In that brief exchange, the tension of years seemed to dissolve, replaced by the quiet peace of acceptance. Paul passed away in 2008 after a private battle with cancer, leaving behind not just a legacy of films and philanthropy, but also a lifetime of lessons about love, failure, and forgiveness. At his funeral, Joanne stood beside their daughters, her eyes filled with both grief and pride. She had lost the man who had been both her greatest love and her greatest challenge. Their marriage, with all its imperfections, had endured the very trials that destroy most Hollywood unions. In the years following Paul's death, Joanne's health declined, and she began to suffer from memory loss. But even as her recollection of the past faded, one thing never did: her love for Paul. Their daughters often found her sitting quietly, looking out the window, murmuring his name as if he were still there. To them, it was proof that despite everything, the rumors, the arguments, the long silences, love had always been the thread that held them together. In a rare interview, their daughter Claire spoke candidly about the reality of her parents' marriage. They were far from perfect, she said, but they never gave up on each other. People think Hollywood love stories are built on fairy tales, but my parents' story was built on forgiveness. Today, when fans look back at Paul and Joanne's photos, they see the smiles, the awards, and the glamour. But what they don't see is the price of maintaining that image. Behind the scenes was a woman who sacrificed her spotlight for her husband's success, and a man who struggled to live up to the ideal the world expected him to be. Yet, despite all the pain, their love endured. Joanne's final years were marked by peace. She lived surrounded by family, comforted by the legacy she and Paul had built together, one not of perfection but of perseverance. Their daughter once said, "They weren't movie stars at home. They were just mom and dad," still trying to figure it all out. Now, as both Paul and Joanne rest side by side, their love story stands as a reminder that even the brightest lights cast shadows. And in those shadows, the truest parts of their hearts were found, flawed, human, and forever bound together.